Good morning. So there was a little change in plan. So if you're here to see Caroline Reistad, you need to go upstairs. This is today we have our final Cuban presenter. And I just personally, I have to say, this has been such a great addition to the Nordic Light Festival to have the Cuban exhibition and presentations. It's just been the highlight for me. And so now I have the privilege and honor to introduce Adrian Fernandez, and please welcome him to Nordic Light.
Thank you very much. All right. Is this working? Yeah. I feel like a mini pop star with the mic here. Okay. It is a selection of works, what I'm bringing here today, from 2007 to 2013. I work in series, so you'll see around 3 or 4 groups of images that are part of a series, and I'll be talking of them in general terms, and then at the end, if you like, I can take as many questions as you ask. Sketches for a profile study. It's lifestyle sketches for a profile study. It's the name that I have chosen to gather all this group of work that I've been doing in this time. Each series has a particular name you'll be seeing on the screen. So the first one that I'll be showing today, it's lifestyle series. Until this point, this is not my first work. It's rather advanced. But to give you an introduction about it, my work had to do with the image of Havana City, how it looked physically. Of course, taking as a pretext the shape of their buildings. I had long exploited and worked with the old part, the old Havana, the colonial part of the city, which is far more in a worse condition. It is probably the most known image of Cuba as well. But in an attempt to get a more complex image that tells of the Cuban context today, of Havana City today, where I live, I started photographing a different part of the city, one that apparently is not that attractive, one that doesn't have tourists walking through it. This is a part of Havana that was built in the 1940s and 1950s, before the revolution, one built for an upper middle class, closer, again, to the so-called American way of life. So this part, again, you can see spacious houses, again, built for a wealthy class back in the 50s, before the revolution. And it definitely represents, symbolically, a different society project. My first approach was from the facade point of view, addressing these houses, how they look to anybody that walks in the street from the sidewalk. Originally, the urban scheme showed open spaces. You could easily acknowledge the house from the sidewalk. And well, there was no barrier, there was no fence or limit separating the private space from the public space. Now, what happened in the revolution was a huge exodus and immigration towards the United States, mostly of the people that lived in these neighborhoods. Some stayed living there, others moved in, and those that moved in acknowledged the same social patterns that legitimized them within a certain social context. So again, my approach first was to see them as quite as they looked, from a more documentary perspective, using the black and white. Here I was interested in using black and white as, since you are in the sidewalk, you really don't know that much about what's going on inside. You really don't know much about the families that lives inside. You can only have a general approach. You can tell about the house, you can manage a certain amount of information. It's more or less like the black and white. It doesn't have all the information about reality in terms of colors, but it narrows it down to a gray scale. So that's why I used here, at this point, the black and white. So I followed on in a very objective. These are all very frontal angles. It really doesn't, not too complicated, very straight on, trying to address these places just as they were. So again, this is a partial start. I had a certain amount of information yet that I ignore. So what about the inside? That was what I asked myself. I felt curiosity, in fact. What do they look like? So having had enough arguments describing how they look in the outside, I pushed to a second series that took me towards interiors. Hold on, I don't want to get ahead of myself. And there I go to a second stage, which evolves, the name is portrait, evolves then to the interiors of the houses, but now with a different perspective. Here, if I was more or less hunting the image, I was walking through and photographing what I thought more coherent to my idea. Here was a long process. First, I had to literally introduce myself, explain in the project. Not everybody was very welcoming. Those fences and those bars are not there. They're not very welcoming. You can imagine. So people felt strange. Well, they asked me what's your interest behind it? Why do you want to photograph my house? Why do you want to photograph my belongings? I said, well, I just want to show your Cuba. I want to show a different part of Cuba. I've been attempting to, perhaps I'm pursuing, but at the same time I'm questioning an idea of Cubanity, of an identity, if it's possible to gather Cuban identity in a set of images. I believe that's quite impossible. So this is why I push to a more intimate kind of identity, to see a more private living. So here I went on, starting photographing the interiors, but adding at the same time elements of the studio photography, artificial lighting, that allow me to enhance, as best as I could, these places that I found. I wanted to achieve a sort of architectural digest kind of imagery, but in today's Cuba. I wanted to achieve the ambiguity that kind of image have. Here I don't have a label that says directly, this is Cuba, this is Havana 2010 or 2007. It narrows down to stylistic elements, to aesthetic patterns, decorative, that are a reflect of social status. So that was my goal after it. People sometimes they gave me the key and said, well, you own the house, so photograph as much as you like. Others were more intimate. They allowed me just to be in the social space of the house, the living room, the hallway. That's as much as I could. And here I did not photograph every day. I could have a house to photograph if I was lucky in a month, the one next 2 months. So it took me longer. But once that I had reached when I had the opportunity to get one photograph, then I had one day, make a few sketches, go back, narrow it down to the spaces I was really interested, those that captured the identity of that family in those few objects. Here you'll see the selection that I'm showing here. It's the order that I place them. It actually goes from details to a wider angle. I think it looks better that way. But in fact, my work process was the opposite. By the time you arrive at a house, you get inside a house, somehow I felt overwhelmed by all the objects, by all the decorative objects. So which of them is the more symbolic to represent that family, to represent their house, their culture? it was a process of maturity. So I went, as I said, from widest angles, trying to include everything in the decoration, narrow it down to very few elements as I evolved, as I went on and on with this series. Eventually, moving myself in a particular context, I was really aware of that, and it was part of the arguments that I used. I did not want to photograph a different Cuba. I have seen that a lot. It has been used, it has been photographed. The part that, the most popular and inhabited part of Havana in the old shape, I wanted to photograph this other part. They live better in a way. So my intention was to give an image that offers a more complex approach towards the context. There's nothing black and white in real life. It has lots of tones in between, lots of shades. So my intention was that. This has been a context that has been taken aside ideologically for many years, although many people live there, important people. But because it's not what a system sells, it's not what a system promotes as a way of life. So visiting them today, for me, was in itself an attitude, was in a moment of changing. I am going back, I am reevaluating places, cultures, aesthetics, social levels. I'm reevaluating them. And I'm doing so, well, I try not to judge, at least in my photograph. Of course, you're always judging at a certain point because you're framing, you're choosing somehow, you're making an addition then for me to show it to you. But you can make that statement in a more explicit way. I try to do it in a more ambiguous. I think the statement that I do is rather in as an overall work, but instead of a statement in a single image. So by the time you start photographing all these houses, you notice the patterns. It's when you move in the same social context, you start to notice the decorative patterns, how they are repeated from one house to the next one. And it's a fun thing to notice that. It was how I measured that I got my point of what I wanted, and it was the moment to move on. I did so taking elements that I learned. When I started this project, the lifestyle project, I acknowledged two main series. Okay, I might be able to, I for sure can do the facade. If I'm lucky, I might be able to do the interiors. Never saw a third one, and it came as a surprise by the time I was taking this photograph, and I was learning about the decoration and noticing the aesthetic patterns. Then here I arrive to a third stage series, To Be or to Pretend, one that marks as well the step towards the studio photography, definitely, which is what I'm doing currently. Until this point, I was in between, working outside, doing half documentary with mixture and elements of studio photography, but here is entirely studio photography. So it's yeah, it looks good. So these are the centerpieces that I found in all these houses. It was, in fact, one of the strongest decorative patterns that I noticed in all these places. You could always see in, I don't know, in the social parts of the house, the centerpiece with a tablecloth, with a bowl or a plate, a vase, with any variation of fruits and even flowers. But itself, what attracted me and actually made me going for it was the fact that these are always fake. These are all made out of plastic, made out of silk. So it was quite ironic to have a set like this of apples, pears. If you're not going to eat them eventually, well, what's the purpose of having this if it's not to project an image that you obviously don't want to change. You don't want to see it fade away. The plastic has the advantage to preserve that image. It projects it. So That was what really mattered here. It was a matter of projecting an image. So these small spaces, for me, synthesize everything that I had photographed before, but in a higher density. It was more synthesized here. You could always see it with a certain pattern in the back. It could have been a tablecloth, a bed sheet, a curtain. So I started gathering all of this. I did not photograph them right away. These are not merged textures as you're seeing them right now, but it's scattered around the house. That was the advantage that gave me photographing the house ahead, making that series ahead of arriving here. It was a process of maturing. It's a different training. So I found myself collecting this for, I would always ask them for around a month. In my studio, I would have a set of 20 tablecloths, curtains, whatever kind of cloth I found, with plates, bowls. Anyway, it wasn't a whole market that I had in my studio, but of plastic fruits and flowers. So the advantage that gave me, the advantage and the problem at the first moment was that having them all available, I could really combine them in endless combinations. So what was going to be the decision I was going to make? What was I going to put there in those combinations for what they were going to answer for? So here was a crossroad. I could either combine them, rather following my own preference, my own aesthetic preference as an individual, in which case perhaps it would have been different. Or I could learn more of what I saw within the house. So I did my best to go for the second option, to learn out of what I saw in those places. Sometimes people that have seen my work say, well, no, yeah, but it's a kitsch kind of photography. It's very intense, saturated. And, well, it's possible. I give them that. But I never label these images. I never labeled the aesthetic of that houses. It was as possible, as valid as any other. Perhaps others are more sophisticated. But my intention here was to acknowledge as it was. So in those combinations, ideally, perhaps I would have all these elements from a single house. To be honest, that happened 2 or 3 times. Most of the time, it was a combination. I could have the vase or the fruits from a single house and perhaps the backdrop from a whole different location. But what really interested me was that these were the original objects. These were the leading characters of the interior decorations in those houses. So there's a direct relation there, and in a way, there's no doubt that it's a stage photograph. It is clear enough. I took 100 images to get this one. I changed the lights, I changed the setting, I changed the camera position, changed the combinations, moved the pair several times. But in a way, it also plays with the idea of documentary, because it tried to capture that aesthetic. It tries, again, using the real elements, captured part of the visuality of this part of the Cuban context today. Yeah. It was inevitable that some turn out in a more baroque, heavy texture that you can barely acknowledge the shape in the foreground and the texture in the background. It's all blended. It was part of the dynamic of the decoration. Sometimes people, well, the Cuban, I would say Cuban culture is, and the aesthetic is baroque itself. It's a mixture. And they're not very fond of empty spaces. So they tend to gather, to fill every white wall with heavy texture, decoration, with golden shapes and shining. That's they look legitimation. So here it also happened that for me, this I thought the people sort of had them as a shrine there in order to legitimize an status. That's also there. It's an aesthetic that is related with good living, with a good economical position. So they exist as well as a symbol of power in a way. So, no, these are all possible angles that have the I went on for about 2 years doing this work, not with the intention of repeating myself, but rather to have as many arguments as I could. Each time I found a combination, it was an extra argument that I had to defend my work, and again to build this sector in images, this social sector in images. So at this point, I was kind of overwhelmed by all this heavy texture imagery, and well, I took a pause. Again, here I did not photograph every day. Sometimes for a single image, it took me a month until I have let's say, the most adequate combination, and then I could photograph them. Photographing them itself, the act wasn't that complicated once I figure out how the image is going to look like. I work like that. I have a period of uncertainty. That is when I figure out how a series is going to look like. But once I have arrived there, okay, this is going to be in a square format, I'm going to use this kind of lighting, I'm going to crop the image that way. In this case, it was very straightforward again. Nothing happens itself in the framing, but everything that matters there is in the object itself, in the combination. So photographing it was rather simple. It was a very simple technical solution, and then the image came out. Of course, in a post-production stage, that's when I really achieved a good combination and an appropriate level of in terms of saturation and luminosity. So I took a pause and I went later on to our fourth stage that concludes this whole evolution from the facade, the interiors, the details of the decorative objects. This one pushes further. As I went more and more, starting from a very specific social context, from the facade, it evolves. As it evolves, it goes spreading and achieving a wider context for the image. Here doesn't necessarily has to be Cubas in here, but there are other things that are more important. I don't really need to place you, or the work needs, in order to be acknowledged or to be appreciated, for me to place you there. It has a wider readings into it, and I was pursuing that. Here I went about the aesthetic possibility of emptiness. I went even more. I went even closer, but I like to do things in contrast in my work. If I have a series or if I have an idea that I already know how to do, I don't do it. I don't do it at all. I always try to look for a challenge in the work, otherwise it's too boring. So here was, if from one side in the previous series, it was more ironic, it was not ironic, but heavy texture, baroque elements. Here I went to the other side. I went to a more clean, minimal kind of aesthetic. Perhaps I'm more committed to it personally. But one that takes, again, those very same fake objects, but in a more ironic way, tries to blow them up. Here I go as close as I can physically with my camera, trying to learn and trying to appreciate the fakeness in them. Here, the object itself has a different volume. It's much more present, much more evident. But then you see these marks of the casting molds in the plastic. So it cheats you there. What happens with this series, well, to be honest, I've never printed this big. They're not meant to see that big. But when you see the actual image, you can actually think, okay, it's a banana, or perhaps, I don't know, it's an orange. But when you really look, you can see a detail that reveals the real material quality of it. It's actually an image of an image. It is something that recreates something from reality. At this point, I would say that flowers, and I'm not particularly fond of flowers and fruits, they have been a pretext for me to photograph, to exteriorize concepts. Well, I do appreciate them, and I like them as any other person, but I'm not particularly fond of them. It has been a pretext for me to photograph. Here, it is an object that tries to imitate something from reality, something from nature, as good as it can. Nevertheless, it'll always fail. The image might be, at some points, more successful. Others might be rougher. But it'll never be able to change the essence of it. It'll never be able to be an actual grapes or a pear. The essence of it will never be able to imitate. So, yeah, that's more or less the idea behind this work. The image itself, the image that represents something. How real is it? Ironically, aesthetically, it's a cleaner ending. It's a cleaner aesthetic in this series. But it was way harder work. If by the time I was doing the previous work, I took a long time finding the objects. Photographing them, again, was rather simple. But here it was the other way around. I found them very fast, small object in itself, but to find the most attractive angle, I needed that. I needed to have a certain attraction in this kind of imagery. It was almost on a sculptural work to go all around the object to look for that angle. So it was fun from that point of view. One is hard work again. Ironically, for the result, it looks easier, looks cleaner. So here again, from when you look at them, the real print is, okay, it's a flower, but when you get inside, a certain roughness starts to show up. You can see the actual texture of the clothing, of the silk, and it's actually rough. It gets a moment that is rougher. I say, well, what's this really? It's an object, it's a fake object, imitating a sort of flower. What is it at the end? Okay, so this concludes an amount of work that it evolved. The arguments for the next series I had from the previous one. Each of them, each stage, shows, introduce the public to this context, to ideas that I also have about it. But it is somehow coherent. I did not foresaw that at a certain moment it could evolve like this. The two next series that I'm going to show today, it's one of the latest projects that I've been doing. I had a solo show in Havana last month with this kind of work. And it follows the same incentive. I think I haven't changed my incentive since I started. I think it's the same one. It's trying to capture an image that tells about a context, that tries to resume them. Again, how valid it is, I don't know. Here, I'm back again to the Baroque. I think at this point I'm kind of committed with it. But if by the time I wasn't showing in the houses, again, a more intimate aesthetic. Here I took as a pretext the imagery of a well-known nightclub in Havana, Tropicana nightclub. It was founded in the 1930s, extremely famous in the 50s, still on today. The nightclub itself resumes perhaps the most romantic and simplest image conception about Cuban identity, about Cubanity. You can see the dancers and the models that work there, staged with exotic costumes, built halfway with feathers, fake jewelry, as exotic human beings. Of course, this is all answers to that conception of the Cuban island, exotic Caribbean country with the voluptuous women. And it is a rather fun conception. So my first approach there, I arrived here by chance, first of all, because they wanted to hire me to do their ad photography for free. No, not for free, but they wanted to hire me. But I was very skeptical about it. But I went, I visited the place, and it has a tremendous vibe. It's very intense itself. It's live rhythm, extremely intense, and I liked it. So my negotiation with them was, in exchange of the advertising photography, which I would do for free, I would run with the production, then I would have to spare time. I would need some time in their storage where they save all the costume of the last 30 years. So here I went to photograph all the costumes they have had, but in small details. It's like acknowledging a wider landscape or a wider, I don't know, sometimes I think out of seeing this image, it looks like a wild beast, but taken in a small parts, in a small photograph. Of course, that overwhelms, that and saturates all the idea that is meant to express with these costumes. Here I went directly to the detail, not as I've done before, which is that goes from the outside to the inside and narrows down. Here I went the opposite. I started with these images. Again, that some of them look entirely abstract. It's difficult to know what they are. It's a lot of shine, very harsh light. I included some of the elements that constitute the show itself, which is the color, very saturated colors and very harsh light. So I include that in flashes, in filters, so that I could have the same effect into this texture. What came out surprised me right away, because the color alters all the conception, all this. It really puts them at an extra level, and that surprised me. I wasn't expecting that, so I was looking at one thing and then photographing one entirely different. Somehow, how it happens when you are on a show, when you see the actual show. It's one thing is on stage. When you get on stage, when the lights hit you in those very saturated colors, then it's a whole different thing. Once I had, at this point, achieved this kind of imagery, I needed a context for it. Now I needed to place it in order. I must also refer about the name of the series. You see Epilogue 1 and Epilogue 2. It is what it is, the word. It is the last part of the book. It is one that recapitulates part of the main story, one that you already know, one that you have read, but yet give you an afterwards, what happens afterwards. I choose that name for these images. It's more or less the same thing. Of Cuba, many things have been heard, many things have happened in contemporary story. There are many things photographed, but sometimes yet, at the end, this is what many people comes looking for, the stereotyped, desaturated images that oftenly we are framed. So here I went to a second stage. It was entirely the opposite. One that creates a context for those images. Here is an inventory of all the looks of the dancers, of the actual models. It's almost like a study of an archetype. It reminds me some of the early photograph of scouts in New Guinea, something like that, in Africa, seeing the costumes of wild tribes to see they look. So it's ironically, at some point, it's halfway between fashion photography and anthropological photography. So this is a set. Here I moved all my studio to the nightclub. So each Friday, ahead of performing, I had a 4 to 5 hour session for 2 months with the dancer or the model I could have available in the costume and in the character it plays every night. I avoided by all means to photograph the place itself, since it has been extremely photographed. There's really nothing attractive about it. But the context, it's at some point ambiguous. This is as much as I go for a context, the person itself, the one that wears it, the one that constitutes the final image, the one you see on a stage, the one that impacts you when you are there. It was the first experience that I had as well, working with persons which I'm not particularly fond to photograph. I don't like to treat them as subjects. But in this case, for my advantage, knowing their work, knowing their profession, it was rather easy to address them, to tell them, move to a side or move towards another side or start this pose again. So it was a very intense work for that point of view, and very challenging. It was a larger productions and I had to move all the equipment there. Yeah. There you are. So this is pretty much about my work until today. I really have nothing else to show. Again, thank you. Thank you a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have some time for some questions. Maybe turn up the light just a little bit. Yeah? Great. In the back, yeah.
I would like to know what kind of people live in these houses.
Yeah.
Is it what money and what are the businesses what can they live in this
Let me repeat. So the question is something about the people in the houses. I mean, I think
who
we
are
all
the
have
people
that
that live
question.
inside?
We all have that question. We want to know more about them.
I can answer it halfway because I never actually met them in order to tell you who they are. But obviously people that have a good economical position, that works either for a foreign company or many people ask me if some of them work for the government. To be honest, none of them were, or at least none that I knew about. But people that somehow make a good living. Some have purchased these places recently, and they have moved in, and they have found elements that legitimizing within a context to be part of it, to show their new rising power. Others have held that position, have sustained it, stay there and preserve their values. In those cases, those values are more heritage than assumed. So that's the difference. Some assume it in order to fit. Others are simply what they inherit. All of them are resumed behind those fake flowers, behind those fake fruits. You really don't know when's real, when's fake. everything is, at this point, it narrows down to an image. But it was all sorts. Some persons worked abroad, were married with foreigners. I'm thinking on the families that I met, and I'm telling you, the combinations were incredible. Perhaps a couple of them worked in the government, but I didn't really know about it.
So I'd like to let me just follow up because it makes me think more that what you did with the club, for example, you started off with the details, but then, frankly, it was very refreshing to then see those details draped in the human form. I crave to do the same, see the same for the homes. You know, you've got the details.
I think on that in the same. I think it's the same process. It's. I don't know. I could think on the models as perhaps the facades or even the vases with the flowers. I think it's the same thing. As I told you, I haven't really changed my subject, but renew and look new things to photograph, new pretexts to visualize.
Yeah. Did you want to follow up? Yeah.
Oh.
You can hear the question, right? So, whether this is a typical Cuban style, American style, was this something that stuck in the 50s?
I don't know what you said is fun. It's interesting. It is definitely, you can see them, and they are supporting in a good shape. You can see them clean, well preserved. Yeah. But the overall aesthetic of it, you can see that it's rather old-fashioned, rather from 40s, 50s, perhaps some of them 60s. That tells you until the moment that influences a state arrived and then a state put, they did not evolve afterwards. It was, in fact, a very objective thing that with the revolution, the renewing all these subjects that you could easily purchase in a store, American stores in Havana. You could either have objects, Bohemian glass vases, or sent from Paris. It was a rather fashionable context, but it all stopped. So the influences stopped there. You can also see that, and that's at the minute you might get confused, thinking, okay, this is an interior design magazine's photograph. There's that note, okay, but what about the design line? It's not either contemporary, not entirely old-fashioned, but it's a way in between that is ambiguous. People try to preserve what they had as best as they could. They grab on till the few objects that told about their past to live on, to preserve that heritage in a way.
The cars, there's many photographs of the Cuban cars that we've seen, and there's the same kind of feeling that, oh, I recognize that car from the 50s. And it's because it's in Cuba, for the most part, there's a lot of that just stopped. Yeah, and now I think it's the same kind of like recognizing the past.
It is definitely the same thing.
Through those photographs. I want to make sure, anybody else? Yeah.
What is your hope for the future for yourself as a photographer and
Wow. Your hope for the future.
That's another lecture, Kate.
Do you want to live in do you want to live in one of those houses?
I don't live far from that context. The idea of go to visit it was part due because I really knew it. I knew those places I live around. So it was also a process of seeing an image, the part that really belonged to me of the Cuban image, and of course the attempt of getting it. As for I have no side jobs. I have photographer 100% of the time. So I have a couple of projects on. I don't have a particular way of doing photography. Each project, each idea I try to find a new way to photograph it. If he has a certain relation with the previous series, I don't know, and I really don't care about that. I actually going for new things that I don't know how to photograph, for the things that in the first place offer a challenge, but also that at a certain point has to do with Cuba. Although the final image doesn't have a sign and a stamp of origin. I'm not interested on that. But the incentive that I take, the inspiration that I take in my work, they all come from there. I'm proudly Cuban. I live there. I like to travel. I have the opportunity to travel and meet different places. And that has always making me go back. And that's where I work and show it around the world. It was what I wanted to be as a photographer and the future of Cuba. Well, the best of future, what can I tell you? That's what I want for my country and for my people. Always the best, to improve, to go further, to make a more fair society, to make the better living for the regular person. Doesn't have to be that difficult to reach, and I think we'll do it. We'll do it. We have achieved some, and it should be better. Yeah.
It makes me think about the fact that the more specific you are, sometimes the more universal you become.
Yeah, definitely.
Many of those details, you become more and more and more specific, and so they reach beyond the context, and yet they are anchored in that one.
Once I was having a discussion with it was an art critic, seeing my work. Said, well, what kind of an artist you want to be? Do you want to be an international artist and a Cuban artist? And at that moment I said, being a better Cuban artist, I might be a better international artist, if any. In any case, I might be prouder being a Cuban artist.
Yeah.
We don't hear back here.
The questions? Yeah, well, the question was just in two parts. One about his future as a photographer, and one is the future of his country, Cuba. Yeah, you heard the answer, yeah.
Oh.
Okay?
Yeah.
I'll repeat the question next time. Yeah?
Yeah, I was wondering if you, since you gathered like a quintessence, of this social group in Cuba, you have this a lot, these kind of patterns, let's say, in poorer homes of poor people. You got interested in that because I think it's interesting, since you elaborated this quintessence, like this bowl of fruits, you have it in different contexts, and if that would interest me.
So let me just try to repeat. The question, I guess it's a question of contrast in the sense that, so this was this is the approach that was used for these types of homes, and wouldn't it be interesting to do the same approach to the, let's say, the poorer homes or the less fortunate homes? Yeah? Yeah. So, yeah, sorry?
That have similar
To pull out the elements and look for the similar elements, right?
Yeah. Oftenly, it's a question that I found because people say, "Well, you took side for photographing this part. Why haven't you photographed the other one?" It's in fact in poor living places in Havana. That, in fact, was something that was very clear to me by the time I was starting. I did not want to photograph the other part. I have seen it already. I have seen it in Cuban art. I have seen it photographed extensively in tourist catalogs and magazines, in reportage. I haven't seen the other part. The other part placed the challenge for me. Offered a more complex context by the time you consider this one that I photographed and that one that has been extensively shown. The possibility, I choose the possibility of something better. There's nothing wrong about it. It is there, it exists. I just document it. I revisit it. For a long time, it was places that were ideologically concerned. It's not the appropriate living we want to offer for a socialist country, but it's there. I did not invent it. I photographed it. Now, adding and thinking in all these images, also considering this one I bet you haven't seen that much in that magazines. It gives you then a much more complex. As I told you, it's far from being black and white. It's an array of angles and perspective. I took one, and I'm questioning the partiality of the identity. I cannot resume you what's Cuba today. It is impossible for me to make a statement like that. I can only give you a partial statement. And I often think of my work not as a series, but I do invest time thinking of it as the overall perspective. I try to cover different angles. Then in the future, perhaps when I'm older, I have a statement to make.
Mm-hmm. We have time for one more question? All right. If nobody else will take it, I'll take it. Oh, go ahead. No.
What will be your next project?
The question is, what will be Adrian's next project?
Well, as I can tell you that it's happening on a studio. At this point, I like to think ahead of my work. I don't hunt an image. I don't work every day either. I can spend a couple of months without working, taking a few shots, doing experiments, making mistakes. It's very fun making mistakes, and it leads you eventually to a good clue. I'm studying a new set of images that has to do with published imagery in Cuba in the last 40 years. It's a research on published images in magazines and in posters, in stamps. So it has to do with that. How it's going to end visually, I'm still trying to figure out. Hopefully, perhaps in 4 or 5 years, I'm back here again in Northern Light.
That would be great.
Then you'll be able to see it.
Well, welcome back in 4 or 5 years, and thank you so much for coming this year.
Thanks to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you.